Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island is a highly regarded 1998 direct-to-video release that single-handedly revived the stagnant Scooby-Doo franchise, which had been suffering through a sequence of lousy TV series and one-off specials during the 1980s and most of the 1990s, or what I call the Red Shirt Shaggy period. Zombie Island is to Scooby-Doo what the pre-mental breakdown Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns and Year One was to Batman, offering a darker, more adult feel to a character long considered campy by taking the subject matter seriously and redefining the look and feel for a generation. Gone was the kiddie-friendly fare of bad guys in cheesy costumes jumping out and going boo, replaced instead with actual supernatural villains with murderous intentions for the Scooby Gang. Set in the contemporary late 1990s, Zombie Island tells the story of a fractured Scooby Gang getting back together in order to help Daphne Blake, now a TV show host, and Fred Jones, her perpetually friend-zoned, or would that be Fred-zoned, cameraman and sole crew member. Daphne is determined to cover legitimately supernatural events for her show and not just another hapless crook using cosplay to disguise real estate fraud or a treasure hunt. The rest of the gang hadn't been idle all this time, with Shaggy Rogers and Scooby-Doo improbably working as customs agents and Velma Dinkley running her own mystery-themed bookstore, yet they each clearly missed their old lives chasing mysteries with their friends. The gang decides New Orleans would be the best place to look for real ghosts and monsters, but to Daphne's disappointment, everyone they find ends up being fake. They finally hit pay dirt, however, when they encounter Lena Dupree, who invites them to her home on the nearby bayou's isolated Moonscar Island, where she promises that the hauntings are real. Daphne jumps at the offer, and the gang arrives later that day where they meet the island's owner and Lena's employer, Simone Lenoir. Moonscar Island is also populated by the usual assorted potential suspects and red herrings: Jacques the ferryman, Bo the gardener, and irritable fisherman Snakebite Scruggs and his hunting pig Mojo. The island is also overrun with cats to the point that even Ernest Hemingway would have been annoyed. As expected, supernatural shenanigans ensue, but Fred remains skeptical, assuming that they are the actions of a villain running a scam. These suspicions are made all the more plausible after the gang learns the island was named after a notorious pirate, Captain Morgan Moonscar, who presumably buried treasure somewhere on the grounds. However, it eventually becomes apparent that this time, the hauntings are all too real. This will not be a critique of the film, though it is expertly voiced by veterans like Frank Welker, Billy West, Mark Hamill, Tara Strong, and the late Mary Kay Bergman. Better animated than most direct-to-video productions at the time, including the tripe Disney was putting out, and remains one of my favorite Scooby stories. What we will focus on is how Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island features a higher body count than all of the Friday the 13th, Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, and Batman v Superman films combined. The Moonscar Island killings begin near the end of the 18th century with the slaughter of an entire colony of settlers by Morgan Moonscar and his crew of pirates. The second mass murder takes place almost immediately afterward by the only survivors of the previous massacre, Simone and Lena, exacting their revenge. They do so by transforming into vicious feline monsters through the magic of the cat god worshipped by the colonists. In these forms, they butcher Moonscar and his entire crew, but unfortunately for the two women, their thirst for vengeance ends up becoming a curse, which requires them to suck the life force out of human victims once every harvest moon in order to retain their immortality. A third massacre happens over half a century later when the cat creatures wipe out an entire plantation of pepper farmers. The remaining killings consist of the annual murder of unwitting victims lured to the island by Lena for the women, and later Jacques the ferryman, to consume. Unfortunately, a conclusive Moonscar Island body count is not possible, as few exact figures are stated in the film. But some educated guesses can be made based on what is revealed. First, in order to guess how many victims fell prey to the cat creatures, it is necessary to determine when the Moonscar Island curse actually began. The only specific mention of a time was when Simone claimed,
"I've been getting away with it for 200 years."
Though extremely coincidental, it is possible that the Scooby Gang's 1998 visit to Moonscar Island occurred on the curse's bicentennial, making 1798 its origin. Simone's claim aside, a good clue is the clothing featured in the flashback. While all the colonists are dressed very plainly, the men wear coats that end at the waist, a style which came into fashion after 1770, which matches the 1798 estimate. Another clue is the pirates. What people usually think of when it comes to these marauders of the sea happened during what's called the Golden Age of Piracy, which ended around 1730 or 68 years before 1798. This does not necessarily mean that 1798 is wrong, because piracy never really ended and Moonscar could have been pillaging at the end of the 18th century. Also, not only does Moonscar wear a bicorn hat, which didn't come into vogue until the 1790s, he wears it athwart, as opposed to how sailors commonly wore the headpiece after 1800 in the fore and aft position. This dates the curse to the 1790s, again matching the 1798 estimate. In the end, nothing immediately rules out 1798 as the curse's origin, so that is the year we will use, because even if it isn't, it's likely close enough. The year Jacques the ferryman joined the cat creatures also has an impact on the final body count. Unfortunately, the only thing stated about his connection to the curse was,
"We needed a ferry driver. The old man wanted immortality, so we gave it to him."
As this doesn't even offer a hint as to the year he was afflicted, we'll need to look for other clues. Jacques appears to be a man in his mid-50s, and as both Simone and Lena appear exactly the same as when they were cursed, despite being over 200 years old, this particular type of immortality seems to effectively freeze the victim at whatever age they were at the time. It stands to reason Jacques was well experienced as a ferryman when recruited by Simone, because not only would she want someone she could trust, but he would also have to operate as the ferry's sole crewman. This means he likely had no less than 10 years' experience with diesel engines, putting the year he was cursed at no earlier than 1960, since diesel engines predominantly came into usage in the 1950s. If 1960 is the earliest he could have been cursed, and the year before the events of Zombie Island, 1997, is the latest, comfortably splitting the difference means Jacques has been a cat creature for about 20 years. Now, to determine the number of victims for each of the three massacres: the original settlers, the pirate crew, and the pepper plantation. At no point do any more than a dozen colonists appear on screen, but it's highly unlikely they were the entirety of the colony. Rather, that's just what was animated. To save both time and money, a frequent shortcut used in traditional cell-based animation was to draw much less than what would actually be there, like how large cities have very little foot or vehicular traffic, or most cartoon characters, even human ones, have 4 fingers instead of 5. The exact number of settlers is never explicitly stated, but looking at similar historical examples, like the 115 people in the doomed Roanoke colony, the 102 Plymouth Pilgrims, and even the 87 entrees on the Donner Party menu, it stands to reason the Moonscar Island settlers probably numbered close to 100 people. In addition to Captain Moonscar himself, no more than 8 of his crew is shown. Though again, as previously mentioned, this is hardly a good indicator due to the limits of animation at the time. While a ship the size of the Maelstrom would generally have no less than 50 crew members, pirates would often sail with far fewer than that if they weren't actively raiding. as it appears Moonscar's massacre of the settlers wasn't a planned raid, but rather his reaction to finding colonists who'd inadvertently settled on the island on which he chose to bury his treasure. A conservative estimate of the number of pirates would be around 24. The pepper plantation population is difficult to estimate. On screen, no more than 5 individuals are ever shown, but it is inconceivable that such a small number of people could not only construct a building of that size, but also plant and harvest such a large pepper crop all in less than 2 years.
The plantation flourished.
At least until the harvest moon.
This means the farmers had to arrive at some point after the previous harvest moon and long enough before the current one to build the plantation and plant the crops, because if they'd arrived any earlier, they'd have been killed the previous harvest moon before finishing the plantation. Antebellum southern plantations varied greatly both in size and population, with the smallest having a single family and perhaps 1 or 2 slaves, to the largest with a few dozen family members and hired hands, along with hundreds of slaves. Lena claimed the plantation was founded by a boat full of spice traders, and based on the size of the ship, several dozen people is not an unreasonable guess. Further, Tabasco sauce is produced on a Louisiana island, was founded around the time of the U.S. Civil War, and per the company's official website, 100 of their employees live on the island itself. So, conservatively speaking, the pepper plantation likely had no fewer than 50 people. With the mass murders out of the way, we turn to what is undoubtedly the hardest to quantify of the Moonscar Island victims: the random yearly sacrifices. There had to have been at least 2 per year, or 1 each per cat creature, since 1798 to satisfy the curse. So subtracting the first year, the year of the pepper plantation slaughter, and 1998 when they were thwarted by the Scooby Gang, the total would be 394 victims that Simone and Lena needed to consume. Adding an additional 20 for Jacques, for the probable 20 years he was a cat creature, we arrive at a total minimum of 414 random victims. Thus, the initial minimum body count is as follows. Additional evidence, however, would imply that these figures may be far, far too low of an estimate.
Over the years, boats continued to come to our island.
We can safely infer from Lena's words that each year saw more than just 2 victims, as these visiting boats undoubtedly carried more than 2 passengers or crew. In fact, the ease by which Lena was able to lure the 5 members of the Scooby Gang, as well as hiring Bo as their gardener that same season, means the cat creatures were very well experienced at handling at least half a dozen victims at a time. Additionally, there's no way of knowing how many actual victims were needed to satisfy the curse. For all we know, it could take multiple victims at a time to meet the cat god's demands. Therefore, it's not unreasonable to set the minimum number of victims to be as high as 6 per year for the past 200 years. Thus, the revised minimum body count would be Again, this is a minimum body count. The actual figure could be, and probably is, much higher. After all, Simone and Lena were capable of murdering several dozen well-armed pirates. Clueless tourists would be no match for the ferocity of the cat creatures. One argument against the high body count is how could that many people disappear on or near Moonscar Island without the authorities investigating? Granted, Bo the gardener did turn out to be an undercover policeman doing precisely that, but certainly there must have been dozens of investigations over the years, right? Remember, nothing says that the murders had to take place on Moonscar Island or that people had to disappear on or near the island itself. Simone and Lena were shapeshifters, not ghosts. They weren't haunting the island. It was just their home and place of worship. There's no reason they couldn't have spent plenty of time off the island procuring victims from anywhere in the country or even the rest of the world. They could have traveled into war zones or other areas of political upheaval, kidnapped any number of people and brought them back to the island, or simply drained them on the harvest moon wherever they happened to be at the time. Hell, they could even be the source of local superstitions all over the Americas whenever bodies turned up mutilated or mummified. Moonscar Island was a convenient hideout, but wasn't necessarily a requirement to meet the demands of the curse. That would also explain why there wasn't hundreds of zombies seeking revenge at the end of the film, because not all of the remains of Simone and Lena's victims were buried on the island. What about the missing pepper plantation farmers? Surely their customers would wonder why their pepper orders were never delivered, and most of the victims probably had extended family who would worry after no longer receiving mail from their loved ones, right? Again, we'll never know for certain, but here's my theory. The United States Civil War was going on around the same time the pepper plantation was built. Simone even mentioned the Confederate Army maintained barracks on the island, which I assume the cat creatures avoided because their version of immortality may not be much use against cannon fire. There were a few Confederate soldier victims shown, but they were probably killed off base, and their disappearances written off as desertion or otherwise MIA. Regardless, war has always been a time of confusion, and disruptions in trade or mail would have an easy explanation. After the war, while taking possession of the Confederate barracks, the victorious Union troops could possibly have come across the remains of the pepper plantation, and imagine what they found. A damaged building and signs of struggle, but no bodies. While eerie, these aren't uncommon situations to find after a war. Violent cat creatures would not be the first thing that springs to an investigator's mind, nor would they likely attribute the mayhem to Confederate soldiers, as the plantation did not produce a crop desperately undersupplied soldiers would have looted. Rogue Union troops seeking revenge against Southern civilians would, however, be a much more logical explanation for the damaged property and missing people. As the war had just ended, it wouldn't do any good for the Union Army's reputation, let alone the efforts to mend the ties between the North and South, for such a possible war crime to be investigated or even reported. So it's likely the existence of the pepper plantation was quietly and quickly swept under the rug, and the plantation remains left alone for the bayou to reclaim. Only instead of that happening, Simone and Lena took the land for themselves, turning it into a very comfortable, forgotten hideout from the rest of the world. In most stories involving were-creatures, the monsters are often subjects of sympathy. They're usually victims themselves, forced to live indefinitely with the blood-drenched guilt of their actions. Simone and Lena, however, are hardly worthy of sympathy. Though they did start out as victims, seemingly wanting no more than to live peaceful lives practicing the religion of their own choosing, their later actions made them even more monstrous than the bloodthirsty pirates who slaughtered their community. It could be argued their vengeance against Moonscar and his crew was justified, but they didn't have to remain immortal. They could have gone on to live a normal human lifetime, perhaps starting new lives elsewhere, or simply remaining alone with each other on the island until peacefully dying of old age sometime in the middle of the 19th century. Instead, they greedily expanded their own lifespans at the cost of possibly well over more than 1,000 innocent lives. Ruby-dooby-doo!